So here we're really looking at the fisheries and habitat management practices in the regions that are under the purview of state managers. So that's coastal waters out to 3 nautical miles. And obviously humans like to draw these borders that fish don't abide by, and therefore there's often need to be involvement of federal commissions, as in the case of fisheries on the Atlantic coast. That's the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. But overall, we're trying to just neatly look at the coastal fisheries and habitat management that's under the purview of state to regulate, and that we think is most applicable to the interests of this group, and potentially most informative. So transitioning to the focal themes, kind of as we get started, there's an interesting section from a paper from 1979. This is actually about limited entry fisheries. And the author points out that limited entry, there's really no form of it that is going to be best for everybody. And the consequences of limited entry fishery, or indeed any other form of management practice, is really going to be dependent on the social, economic, and I think we would add ecological contexts. And therefore it's really important to consider those when you're trying to figure out what the impact of various management actions are going to be, and where the most beneficial practice is. And I think we'd argue that really you could replace limited entry with almost any of these focal themes, but perhaps most applicable would be the limited entry with also gamefish and gear restriction. All of these actions, really the consequences that come out of them are so context dependent. And in order to really identify what are best management practices, you both have to know what options exist, and then be able to draw on those using things like case studies, which is the approach that we're taking. So to start with, I want to update you a little bit on the progress we've made with limited entry programs and doing a state-by-state synthesis. But first, I just kind of want to give everybody a little bit of background on limited entry fisheries. So before fisheries were regulated in the way they are today, you had kind of open access fisheries where anybody who wanted to participate in the fishery was able to. And that kind of led to the Wild West. You know, everybody's coming in, and to be a bit more serious, it led to issues like we saw with the oyster wars, which was kind of a tragedy of the commons. If everybody can participate, everybody's coming in, and they're just trying to get their little piece before somebody else does, and it leads to mass degradation of a common resource. And an interesting study that kind of exemplifies this was done by Kirby, and in this figure on the right, you see the year of peak oyster harvest. And this paper is actually called Fishing Down the Coast. And what you see is, with particularly early on, people would fish out these resources, and then the fleet would just move and then fish out the resource and continue to move on exploiting them. And obviously this leads to unsustainable fisheries. And as a result, they started to move towards these more managed fisheries using harvesting guidelines, spatial management. But unfortunately, even with these things, so establishing a total allowable catch, saying what regions might be closed during a season, you still have overcapitalization, which is where you have too many people participating in a fishery according to what would be optimal. So one approach to addressing overcapitalization is the use of limited access. And this can kind of manifest in a number of different ways, but basically it just means the number of people who can participate in a fishery is restricted. or there are other types of restrictions on who can access that fishery. So just quickly, I think it's interesting to look at a little timeline to kind of see how things have evolved with limited access. Really one of the first instances you see, early 1900s, Maine permits local communities to restrict access to clam flats, so kind of privatizing some of those resources to some degree. You start to see, in response to overharvest of oysters, that along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, states begin to privatize leasing of oyster bars. 1973, Alaska really is the first state to start instituting limited entry on multiple species, followed closely by California, limiting entry to the roe herring fishery, and Massachusetts putting a moratorium on new lobster licenses. And then kind of as you get to the end of the century, you see this really accelerate. A lot of states are starting to embrace this idea of limited entry, which kind of brings us to where we are today. And this is the first of many tables you'll be seeing today that we compiled. And as Joel mentioned, this is something that kind of at the beginning we're like, well, I imagine this is probably out there. Somebody's probably done this. And after digging through countless documents, I can tell you it's not there, but we hope that this will be a really useful resource and kind of a jumping off point for these further deeper dives to look at implications of these studies. So looking at these states, we see in red, those are the states that have some sort of limited entry, and we've broken this up by finfish and shellfish across 3 categories. So the top 3 in terms of pounds landed, the top 3 in terms of cumulative dockside value, so just what are the dollars associated with that species at port, and then price per pound, so the most lucrative species. And what we see here is we see kind of regionally, there are some states that seem to have embraced limited entry to a greater degree than others, particularly kind of the mid-Atlantic into the Northeast, as well as the Pacific. The Southeast has embraced it somewhat less. And then when we look at it, and when we take a little bit of a deeper dive to actually look at the approaches they're using, we see that there are just a myriad of approaches. So just to kind of break down some of these, in Rhode Island, the requirement to participate is a minimum of 40 trips per year to maintain your currency and be able to be an active commercial fisher. In New Jersey, you have gear-based allocation, and that is based on what you have previously had. So if you were somebody with a lot of gear in the past, that kind of grandfathers that person in to be able to have more gear going forward. Maryland has examples of individual transferable quota where you're actually allocated a portion of quota. This is for striped bass, and then that's basically your quota unless you want to sell it to somebody else. And again, that renews each year. So it's, again, kind of privatizing the fishery to some degree. In North Carolina, we have an eligibility board that determines who is eligible to be considered a commercial fisherman. And that's a little bit more subjective. We have species specific, as opposed to North Carolina. Basically, you have to be eligible as a commercial fisherman or woman to enter any of the fisheries. In Georgia, for specific species, they have a cap number of licenses, and new ones are only available by attrition. We have specific ones where you have a portion of your income needs to be from that dedicated species in order to be able to continue fishing it. Annual renewal required, renewal if you held that license in a previous year. And then there are also tiered levels of participation allowed. So gear specific being allowed a certain number of pots, and that is dependent on your historical participation in that fishery. So this is something that we're potentially going to be taking a deeper dive into, looking at, within particular fisheries, comparing those to North Carolina, places that have different approaches, even if they have limited entry like we do. What approach do they have? A species specific approach to make you eligible to fish that given coastal species, or is it some sort of cap or moratorium on licenses? And that will enable us to kind of look at what are some options North Carolina might be able to investigate, and what might the ecological, social outcomes of those approaches be. So moving on to the next section, which is gamefish. And again, that is a form of resource allocation. Gamefish laws are often embraced because a state has decided that potentially allocating resources to recreational fisheries is beneficial economically, socially. And just to clarify, gamefish laws essentially make commercial sale of a species prohibited. And I'm sure many of you are familiar, in North Carolina, there have been proposals to include speckled trout and red drum as gamefish species. There have been some really interesting research articles looking at the economic conflicts between recreational and commercial fishers. On the right here, you see a paper and a map that I'm sure many of us will be familiar with, highlighting some of the areas that are particularly contentious in this conflict between commercial and recreational over allocation of fisheries resources. And what's kind of interesting to me is, before I started this, I really wasn't aware how many states did have gamefish laws and present a nice gradient that will hopefully allow us to do some interesting comparative studies. And this is a figure that Joel showed earlier. We see that there are a number of states that have embraced gamefish laws. We have a number of states in the Southeast and Gulf that protect or that afford harvest only to recreational fishers for red drum, for spotted sea trout. There's some caveats in the way that's done as well, like Georgia restricts commercial harvest to the recreational bag limits. There are some states that take it even farther, like Florida and Virginia, with species that they actually require catch and release only for. So neither commercial nor recreational are allowed to harvest those species. But as Joel mentioned, I think we'll be able to look at states where they have made the considered decision to restrict harvest to recreational fishers only, and try and see how that's played out in terms of the economic and social and ecological predictions that people make when they're trying to justify these decisions, and see if those have actually come to fruition, how it might apply to North Carolina. And I think there are some really interesting avenues of research here, and we definitely are committed to, if there's interest from the group in looking into this with a really data-driven approach, to see, are the arguments that are made for gamefish species, are they actually vetted out in situations where they have successfully gone through? So another form of resource allocation, and the last one that I'm going to do kind of a deeper dive into today, are gear restrictions. So the archetype of this that everybody kind of thinks of is the gill net ban in Florida in the 90s, and that was obviously a really contentious issue. Closer to home, we've had a lot of debates around use of different gears, regional restrictions. So on the right, there's the map of the proposed special secondary nursery areas. That was essentially looking at, it was a proposal to potentially restrict inshore waters to trawling because they may serve as a nursery area for some species. Ultimately, I think that was did not go through, but it is definitely a continued source of investigation in North Carolina. But what we see when we actually look at the state-by-state synthesis, we see that these kind of prohibitions, there are a lot across different states that provide really valuable case studies to look into the impact. So when we look at outright prohibitions, New Hampshire prohibits all mobile gears from taking finfish or crustaceans in state waters. Virginia prohibits trawl nets within all of their waters, and Florida, with that gill net ban, prohibits gill netting, seining, and then there are large-scale limitations on purse seining. And kind of to provide that nice gradient that we were talking about that allows for these contrasts, there are also more conditional prohibitions. So states like Maryland prohibit use of certain gears within their tidal waters, the same as Virginia, which prohibits the use of hydraulic dredge within tidal waters, but not within ocean waters. And then you have states like Louisiana that pretty much entirely prohibit gill nets and channel and trammel nets, with the exception of allowing them for strike netting of mullet and pompano, which is kind of a very niche use of those gears. So again, allowing for those contrasts that we're potentially going to do a deeper dive into seeing what the implications of those actions are. So just really quickly, Joel kind of highlighted these already, but I just want to go through them, get them fresh in your mind before we get into the discussion, so people can bring up relevant questions or things that they think we should pursue. The final resource allocation focal theme focuses on allocation of fisheries resources, specifically allocation between recreational and commercial harvest. Historically, basically the allocation has just looked at what the historical use of quota has been. So what percent of total allowable catch are commercial and recreational people or participants harvesting, and then set that as the allocation framework. But some states have taken a more advanced approach, and actually an approach that's mandated by Magnuson-Stevens, and used economic or social allocation analysis to reconfigure and reallocate resources. So we want to look at what states have done that for what fisheries, and see if we can kind of nail or whittle down to what the impacts were there. For protection schemes, North Carolina is actually pretty exemplary in their approach to designating nursery areas, with 7% of the state's estuarine waters given some sort of designation. And what we want to do is look at other states and see if they're doing similar types of approaches, whether it be nursery designations, outstanding resource waters, basically anything that is classifying habitat based on its value to juvenile fish, and looking at what protections are afforded to those and how they're going about classifying them. Joel mentioned mariculture. There, we're really going to look at with states that have mariculture industries, do they explicitly embrace mariculture in that state in order to reduce pressure on wild stocks, and then looking at the approaches that they use to address potential public trust infringement. Looking at mission statements, again, as Joel mentioned, we're kind of going to go in and look at what aspects they prioritize, whether they explicitly mention whether they're managing their fisheries with a kind of precautionary or preventative approach, how they prioritize access to these public resources, and just trying to see how those actually translate from what is stated in their mission statement to the actual way that the fisheries are managed. We're going to be looking at the administrative structure. So who is the rulemaking entity within the state? Do they have advisory committees? What are the advisory committees? What are their compositions? Who appoints them? Just to kind of get a better idea of, you know, is it generally very similar to what North Carolina has, or are there entirely different options that would be valuable to kind of look at that and see what the impacts have been, and see if maybe there are lessons that North Carolina could learn